Hello, welcome to today's presentation brought to you by the Life Sciences team at Reed Tech and our friends at Cisema. Today's topic is unique device identification for medical devices and specifically China's expanding medical device requirements. The meeting's being recorded and all audience members are muted. We do encourage questions, so please submit them at any time using the chat box. We'll cover as many as possible during the Q&A at the end. If you're having problems hearing audio, try calling the phone number listed in the email invite or on the screen by clicking on the phone icon. The slides and video link will be sent to all registrants after the live presentation. And we're so pleased to introduce our panelists for today's talk. First, we have Victoria Caldy. She's Business Development and Marketing Director at Cisema. Over 20 years experience providing life sciences clients with planning and strategy, product launches, regulatory approvals, and registrations. Her broad experience includes building a Class 3 medical device company from the bottom up, providing the business with hands-on experience to better serve and solve the challenges of getting to the Chinese market. We also have Hamish King, who is the COO at Cisema. He's a lawyer by training, and Hamish has over 10 years experience in the legal and regulatory fields. He's obtained the RAC and CFA qualifications, and is a regular writer of articles and speaker on China regulatory pathways and registration points. Hamish is originally from Sydney, but has lived in Hong Kong for over 7 years. And last, we have Mr. Gary Sainer, Senior Manager of Information Solutions at Reed Tech. He's a subject matter expert on medical device, unique device identification, and other structured content reporting to regulatory agencies and commercial organizations. He's over 30 years of experience in software development, process management, and data administration, with the last 15 focused on life sciences. And he's also the chair of the industry's structured product labeling technical team and on the advisory board of the medical devices group. Hamish, would you like to take over here and give us a little bit more information about Cisema?
Sure, thank you very much. And thank you for this webinar, which hopefully should be informative for everyone. Just briefly about us, Cisema. We're a regulatory affairs consultancy and service provider, wholly focused on the China market. Victoria and I are part of the team that's based outside China, but most of our colleagues are based inside China, primarily in Beijing, but a number of other offices. We have over 20 years experience, founded in 2002 in Munich, Germany, and Beijing, China. We have various experience across different sectors, including medical device, pharma, cosmetics, health foods, as well as industrial goods and consumer goods. We just have, there's a few more points on the slide here. I won't go into detail, but you're welcome to review at your leisure. Thank you. That's us at Cisema.
Terrific.
Oh, Angela, thank you.
Yeah, a little bit about Reed Tech. We've been in this preparation, submission, and lifecycle data management of medical device UDI product info since the beginning of the FDA pilots. Of over 19 years of experience in SPL, and we work with many trade groups and participate in industry pilots. We've submitted over 750,000 SPLs just to the FDA Good ID. That represents about 1 in 3 records annually. Supporting the US, China, South Korea, and we do have a roadmap for international UDI IDs as health authorities are coming online with machine-to-machine submissions. And we've served over 450 customers since our inception. We work with small to large customers, and our solutions offer flexible role assignments for in-country representatives and corporate users. On the agenda today, we'll be talking about UDI implementation. We'll be talking about the UDI regulatory framework for China specifically, China's UDI and label requirements. Cisema will touch on customs clearance and NMPA inspections, and then we'll talk just a little bit about how both companies can help you in this very complex area. At the end, we'll take live Q&A as time allows. If we don't answer your question live, we'll definitely get back to you individually. All right, with that, I'm going to turn the agenda over to Gary Sainer to take us through UDI implementation.
Well, thank you very much, Angela, and welcome everyone to the presentation today. We thought as a frame of reference and just a little bit of context with UDI being implemented around the world to take a quick look. I know there's a lot of red dots on this screen, but we're going to focus in on China today. There was a batch 1 deadline, and we'll be talking a little bit more detail about that in 2021. But there's a lot of activities around the world, US, EU, and a number of number of health authorities in Asia as well. Next slide. If we look at this year, 2023, again, it's quite busy, but next year is noteworthy, and we'll get in again to more detail about batch 3 occurring in China and then some future activity. But we wanted to share that particular frame of reference. There's a lot of activity around the world, and we feel for all of you in the regulatory departments needing to comply with this particular space. But we really do want to focus in on China, and we'll spend the balance of the time on China. But before we get started, Angela, I believe you have a poll question just to see where people are at.
Yeah, we just wanted to take a quick pulse on sort of what markets you're distributing your products in. So go ahead and click on your selections if you don't mind. We appreciate getting the feedback while we have you here captive. It's always interesting to see the mix across the globe with folks in various markets. So we'll let that be open here for another couple of seconds. All right, so we'll close that down. And why don't we just share the results? And I assume you're seeing the results there. So interestingly, EU pretty big here, and 75% in China, 79% in Australia. Very interesting. Okay, resuming on.
Thanks, Angela. So we're going to take a look now at the regulations impacting UDIs, labels, as well as IFUs. So the main overarching legislation, Angela, is the Order 739, which is the regulation for the supervision and administration of medical devices. This came into effect on the 1st of June 2021. And in particular, it's Article 38 of the Order 731 that calls for an implementation in a phased manner of the unique device identification to assist with device data traceability and ongoing post-market surveillance. And as we'll see today, we're coming up to this third batch or phase of implementation. And there are specific rules and announcements and standards affecting UDI. So first of all, in terms of rules for the unique identification system, this was number 66 of 2019, so it came into effect in October of that year. Now they stipulate the system is composed of 3 parts, of a UDI code, a UDI carrier or label, and the UDI database. Now these rules also state that it's the registrant or filer who is responsible for creating and maintaining the UDI and putting it on a label or carrier and uploading it to the database. The rules also cover the UDI issuing agencies who must be based in China, and that they have to submit a report each year on the UDI before being put on sale. Then we have the provisions for instructions and labels. Now these date back to July 2014. Now they don't specifically state UDI, as this is a new concept since they came out. However, the UDI is expected to figure on the device label, and we'll take a look at this later. Next, we have the provisions for medical device adverse event monitoring. Now they came into effect in January 2019. And as part of any adverse event or potential recall, then the UDI database will be consulted by the NMPA. And there are also provisions in there for ordering revisions of labels and instructions for use if it's found that the device is linked to an adverse event. Then we have the UDI implementation announcements. And in fact, there's been 3, as Gary's just mentioned. There was the first batch in January 21, the second batch in June 2022, and the third batch, which was announced just at the end of last year. And it's just a proposal at the moment. It's just a draft for comments, but it's expected to come into place in just 18 months' time. Then we also have standards which affect the UDI. Now, first of all, there are standards which are specific to the medical device industry, and they're designated by the letters YY. So here you can see various standards. So standard number 1630 from 2018, that covers things such as product ID, down to which level of packaging it should be, the UDI code. Standard 1681 from 2019 lists out all the terminology that needs to be used, then everybody is on the same page. Then in 2020 we had 2 standards, so 1752 and 1753. So 1752 lists all the data sets, and Gary's going to cover this later on. This is what should be submitted to the UDI database. And then the 1753 gives you the guidelines on filling in the UDI database using the data sets from the standard in number 1752. Now, these are the medical device standards, but then we also have national standards. These are designated by the letters GB. So these apply to medical devices as well as to toys, food, in fact, any product that, for example, is using a product QR code. Okay, so they apply to medical devices as well. And there are also rules regarding barcode terminology, so everybody understands the same thing. So let's now take a look at the implementation timelines. So here we can see batch 1. There was an original issue date of September 2019 and an implementation date of October 2020. But just before they came in, there was a revision, and the implementation date was put back by a few months. Now, this particular batch or phase covered certain class 3 medical devices, of which there were 69 listed in that batch. Then we have batch 2. This was an issue date of July 2021 with a proposed implementation date of March 22. But again, a few months later, they were revised and the implementation date was put back a few months. Now, this included all the remaining class 3 devices, including IVD reagents. And then, of course, we've got the recent announcement on batch 3. Now, if it follows the same sort of guidelines, sort of the same scenario, it may indeed be put back later than June 2024. However, the NMPA has given sort of a good 18 to 20 months warning with this draft. So we could expect that it comes in on time. Now, this particular draft of batch 3, phase 3, covers class 2 devices, and in particular, they list out single-use products with large clinical demand, products that fall under the scope of the centralized insurance procurement system in China, anything to do with medical cosmetology, and certain other class 2 medical devices. And in fact, there are named devices and there are 141 of them, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. And then, of course, where there's going to be future batches from 2025 onwards, which are going to cover the rest of class 2 and class 1 products. So as you can see, there's a good 6 to 7, 8 year time frame for actually introducing the UDI throughout the whole of China on all the medical devices. So let's take a look at that batch 3 now, Angela. So as we know, it's a draft and that it covers 141 medical devices. Now then, there are 2 elements to the announcement. So the medical device registration in terms of actual registration. If you apply to register your medical device from the 1st of June 2024 onwards, then the UDI of the smallest unit of your product must be submitted as part of that registration application. So we need to bear in mind that it takes about 18 months to register a class 2 medical device. Now that's if type testing goes to plan and that you don't need a clinical trial. If you haven't already started the registration process, then this applies to you, if indeed batch 3 implementation goes ahead on time. There's also a scenario that if you have a class 2 product in the list that's already registered prior to June 2024, i.e. it means you have your registration certificate before the 1st of June 2024, then you're required to submit to the UDI code to the NMPA only when you renew or make changes to your registration. That could be, for example, you've got some type testing that needs, due to new standards have been issued in China, therefore those tests you will need to submit and make change applications, and then at that time you must submit that UDI code. Then in addition to the registration requirements, we have labeling requirements. So if your product is manufactured on or after the 1st of June 2024, then before placing it on the market, you must get approval from the NMPA for the UDI code itself. So you generate it from the GS1, for example, and then you submit it to the NMPA for approval. And then you will then upload that UDI code to the UDI database, including any medical insurance classifications and codes. So that's if everything comes in on time. But which are the products that are actually covered in this 3rd phase or batch? So here you can see the 15 main categories, of which there are 141 products. So we have things such as active surgical instruments, ultrasounds. You can see at section 6, we have medical examination and monitoring equipment such as pulse oximeters. We have blood transfusion dialysis instruments, ophthalmic instruments, a whole wide range of products that are affected. And you can actually refer to the announcement for the full list. Okay, so I'll hand over now for Gary to take a look at the UDI and label requirements.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Really good summary of the platform, some of the framework that manufacturers need to comply with. We're going to take a little bit deeper dive into the UDI requirements and the actual mechanics and some of the details surrounding UDI. Before we go too far, there may be some in the audience that are relatively new to UDI, so I won't spend a whole lot of time, but just to bring everyone up to speed, I'll do a quick review and definition of what UDI is, that unique device identifier. So there is interest by health authorities to identify products throughout the whole life cycle of a product very uniquely, and it does comprise 2 different components. The first component is always required, it's mandatory, and it identifies the labeler, typically that would be the manufacturer, and down to the specific version and model of a device. So if there's a new model or version that comes out, you'll have to generate a new device identifier. And I'm using GS1 identifiers here just as an example. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is an example of a number that would be identified to a particular company. Actually, that points to Retech. Even though we don't manufacture products, we do subscribe to GS1 and have that identifier for our particular company. Now, the second component is a production identifier, and that is conditional, depending on whether or not a particular control, a production control, appears on the label. So that might include a manufacturing date, expiration date, lot or batch number, and a serial number. Now we're going to touch base a little bit later about manufacture date because that has particular importance for the China market. So if you simply add these 2 together, a device identifier and a production identifier, and again, it could be 0 fields or all 4 fields or any combination thereof, you get a pretty long string there down at the bottom. The red being the device identifier and the blue values being the production identifier. In this particular example, again, representative of all standards, there are some codes. So the parentheses 01, close parenthesis in front of that device identifier, and then there are some other codes that are embedded then into that string. Next slide. Now there are some very unique and particular guidelines that we should be aware of for China. Each health authority obviously layers on a regional set of rules and regulations. You'll find these back in Rule 66 that Victoria had talked about. But there is a presentation of the date format. So if you had not been including the information down to the resolution of a day, you will need to have that in place. So the format being 4 digits of the year, a dash, 2 digits of the month, dash, and then followed by finally 2 digits for the day. Now the manufacturing date is one of the particular production controls that you see across the board for all medical devices. So this is a date that needs to appear on the label, and when you also generate the UDI, it will have to be part of that production identifier. Now in the case of GS1, the example that we are using here, there's an application identifier 11 is designated for the manufacturing date. And those parties downstream from the manufacturing, so it might be distributors, it might be those end users, hospitals, and so on, they are able to verify that this particular product was made within 5 years after the product license was allocated for a particular device. So that information is able to be checked, and the intent from NMPA is that you don't make use of products that have been long in the supply chain or on the shelf and now they're being used and they're actually over 5 years after the license date. So manufacturing date is very important. Put that on the label, and that does allow the downstream users to verify the freshness, if you will, the currency of the actual medical device. Now, the actual components that are on the label, obviously the UDI code. There are some considerations if it's a very small product, very small label. That presentation would need to be either in human readable and AIDC. We'll see that in a second. But AIDC is simply that automatic identification data capture. Usually that's a barcode, and the guideline is that if you're really in a small allocated space and can't put both presentations in, then the barcode should take precedence. The other approach is to include a separate UDI label and affix that next to the device label that may have already been existing. Obviously, the manufacturer date, we talked about that, and there's other mandatory information that has to be on the label, the product identifiers and the quantity and the name of the product and so on. There is some guidelines for creating a new device identifier. Sometimes these are called triggers. So when you have to create a new device identifier, if you do have a change that affects the identification or traceability, the guideline there is that you would need to create a new device identifier. And then obviously if you have a new product, significant design changes, you would need to create a new device identifier as well. All right, next. We have seen and put together this quadrant of 4 different areas, and it's pretty universal as we look at various health authorities around the world. This has been customized for China, and identifying the product, we already talked about that. Direct marking, there are some products that would need to be have the UDI placed right on the body of the product. If the product, the packaging has long been gone and discarded, and if it's reused for multiple patients, so there's some guidelines there. The third component is the reporting of this information to the database. So NMPA has stood up this database UDID, so the UDI database. There's a number of attributes, we'll get into that in a second, that need to be submitted. And don't forget some of the documentation that needs to be in place. So there's this renewal registration for a new license every 5 years. There's surrounding information about UDI. I call that fourth quadrant the forgotten quadrant. A lot of times there's a manufacturer might overlook some of the documentation that needs to go with UDI program. Now, if you actually see the presentation of the UDI, you'll see in red there on the left-hand side, the first portion of that real long barcode is the device identifier, and the blue portion is that production identifier that we talked about earlier. So you are able to present that in a couple different formats, either a single long, referred to as a one-dimensional barcode, or you, in the lower left-hand corner, you can see a two-dimensional barcode. This happens to be a GS1 data matrix. And you do have a third option. You can use radio frequency ID as well. We don't see that used too often, but the single and the two-dimensional barcodes are certainly much more prevalent. Now, the presentation of the actual text is usually placed immediately under a single barcode, and it can be placed under, beside, to the left or right, or actually above the two-dimensional barcode. So you do have some options there, one single long line, or you can break it into multiple components. And the last thing I wanted to talk about are standards. When we come to standards for China, there are three standards that NMPA has approved: the GS1, the Xiat, and the Ali Health. Let's go to the next slide, Angela. I know this is pretty busy. There's a lot of different health authorities across the top there. We're looking at China, so those three that I mentioned, GS1, Xiat, and Ali Health. The only particular standard that you see accepted across all of those different markets is the GS1 standard. So if you are marketing across the world and you have a number of different health authorities that come into play, be aware of the particular standard that you pick. You might have to have a particular set of devices that are targeted for China to be GS1. If you happen to use HIBIC, for example, for other areas like the EU, you can certainly do that, but then you have this dual standard inside your company that you need to work with. But just be aware that HIBIC, ICC, BA, and IFA are not accepted in China. Next slide. So if we take a look at the label, sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge squeezing the UDI barcode into a label, especially if it's really small. We talked about that, but this is a particular sample that we'll just take a look at. Notice the presentation in a linear barcode. There's actually two components that broke apart: the production identifier in the center there, starting with the parentheses 01, and then the production identifier. Also presented in the two-dimensional barcode, and then the text repeated there on the left-hand side. There's other information. The lot number is actually a separate presentation as well. So the lot 1002 appears on the right-hand side as a standalone item, as well as the manufacturing date. So the little manufacturing symbol there with the smokestack. You see the 2023-02-01. Note that when that date is embedded in the barcode, it just uses a two-digit year. So that happens to be a GS1 standard. So there's a little bit different formatting of the dates. Next slide. So there is this question of lowest sales unit and reporting of the particular information to the UDID. In this particular case, we have a sample up here where the base product is in yellow. And in this particular model, it's used and collected 4 of those base products are put into a bag, and then it looks like 5 bags are put into a box. Other scenario where a case is created in a carton. So a manufacturer might ship all of these and place orders or receive and fulfill orders based on boxes. They might get orders for bags. They might even get orders for individual base units as well. Let's say they ship bags out and the distributor then breaks those bags apart and actually sells base products into the marketplace. So in that particular case, the lowest sales unit would be the base product. So that would need to be reported to the NMPA. So there's a lot of different scenarios. We don't have time to get into all the weeds on those different particular scenarios that you might have, but this would be reported at the lowest sales unit, has to be reported to the lowest sales unit. GS1 standard would allow voluntary identification at lower levels of that product hierarchy if you would like. So for business purposes, you might identify all of those particular levels and then do the reporting certainly at the lowest sales unit and above to the NMPA UDID. Next. This is the quick note card that combines a lot of the things that we had just talked about into a single slide. I won't go over this, but we do provide this as a very quick reference page. So you can go back and look at any events that are due, the compliance dates, and the description. Let's move on to the next one. All right, let's turn our attention over to submissions. There is a dedicated database that is for UDI content, and it is part of a suite of 4 relevant databases. There's certainly more under NMPA, but there's 4 that we would refer to here. Certainly the long-standing registration database. So products need to be registered there. You receive your license for the particular product. And then what is new is the second one is this product UDI database. I think well over 2.5, I think 2.6 million records as of now. So it's growing quite quickly. And then there is the National Health Security Database, information about the individuals and their health records and so on, and an adverse event database. So if there's a particular adverse event, that NMPA is collecting that. And there's a key term, UDI is able to be linked as the linking aid identifier in each of those databases to allow some research and cross-referencing. The UDID in particular has all those device identifiers and the number of attributes that we'll take a look at. And manufacturers need to submit that information as Victoria had touched on before commercialization. There are 3 different methods of reporting data into that database. Certainly you could go to the website, log in, make manual entry. The other option is to upload a file. There is a spreadsheet standard that you're able to load data into and then upload that. The third method is a machine-to-machine data transfer where one system talks to the database directly. It's automatic, it goes quickly, very fast and accurate. That's actually one of the particular method that RETEC uses, but this is provided by an API call. So API call into the UDID database allows you to transfer data. Now, what is unique, and Victoria had touched on this, is that if you are manufacturing products in China, so you're a domestic manufacturer and do manufacturing, then you have the responsibility to set up the account inside UDID and submit data. If you're a foreign manufacturer and importing into China, then there is this requirement of a legal agent, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Next. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention, we won't go over each of the fields that are submitted electronically in the machine-to-machine connection. Certainly, the key field there in the upper left-hand corner is that UDI-DI, that device identifier down to the minimum sales unit. There's a lot of attributes about the product. There's information about the registrant, and there's a number of regulatory fields. So one of the key fields there, it would be that unified social credit code down at the bottom, that legal identity for your company. There's some safety fields, packaging information. So we looked at earlier those packaging levels. This is where you'd report those particular configuration levels. Characteristics about the product, a lot of physical in size and storage and handling information. And then there's some questions about production control. So I do want to be clear, those individual manufacturing dates and say a lot number or serial number that you might be using, the actual values are not reported. This is a Boolean field that basically says whether or not you use that control on your label. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about that domestic and foreign manufacturing model. If you're manufacturing in country, obviously you need to abide by the local health authority regulations. Foreign manufacturers that are importing into, say, China, then they need to abide by some regional health authority regulations. And whether it be China, US, EU, South Korea, all of those have requirements for local representation. If you're importing into EU, for example, you'll need an authorized rep. If you're importing into the US, you'll need a US agent. If you're importing into China, you'll need a local agent. That is already in place and well followed. What we want to highlight here is the responsibility for UDI registration. And on the next slide, Angela, we go into some differences. For example, in the EU and US, the manufacturer, whether it be domestic or foreign, has the UDI reporting responsibility. That is different in China and also in South Korea for that matter. The local entity has the responsibility for the product registration. So a foreign manufacturer must use some referred to as that qualified local rep. And that could be a couple different entities. So on the bottom left, we see the chart basically to list out and tabulate what we had just covered. But on the right-hand side, there are some options for the local entity. You might engage an independent local agent to be your representative. The other option is to make use of an importer or a distributor that is, again, in country. Some very large global companies actually own offices in country. So that particular entity can function as your local rep. And then there's some variations there where the foreign parent company might own the majority, but not fully owned, therefore a subsidiary. Or you might have another variation there where the parent company owns only a minority of that office, and now we have an affiliate. So all of those options would fulfill the requirement for a local agent. Next. I think what we want to do now is switch over to Cisema and take a look at some of the inspections and penalties. So are you able to pick up there, please?
Yeah, that's to me. Thanks, Gary, and thank you for your very detailed and knowledgeable overview of the submission process. So I'm just going to talk about being, the lawyer that I am, the checks and inspections part and penalties as well. The key and broad point is that in terms of UDI inspections, there is no specific UDI inspection in China, but rather UDI is checked as part of other checks during random inspections. If there are specific adverse events concerning your device, then UDI is verified as part of that, and the NMPA officer or inspection officer will as a matter of course, check the UDI in the UDI database. It tends to mean that distributors and hospitals are the ones that will report or do the checks on UDI to ensure they fulfill, for example, procurement requirements or other compliance. What happens at customs? UDI, again, is not specifically checked at customs coming into China. However, there are certain checks at customs which will be carried out regarding the label. For example, that the products are correctly labeled, that the batch number and expiration date are on the outer packaging and the product itself, that you have included correct documentation, that the NMPA legal agent, who Gary just explained in detail, and this is a role that Cisema, our company, does as well for many of our customers, act as legal agent, has been given or empowered with the appropriate power to use any filing or or relevant registration certificates. In addition to these checks, there will be random inspections undertaken on labels and quantities of goods as well. Next slide, please. So what happens if you don't comply with the rules? There are penalties, of course. Firstly, you'll be ordered to make corrections to the label UDI or relevant instructions, as well as the UDI database update if necessary. You'll be fined anything between 1,300 and 7,000 US dollars, or roughly the same euro equivalent. If you refuse to make the corrections, then the fines can increase up to 13 or 14,000 US dollar equivalent. With a possible suspension of production and business activities, including marketing, distribution, and selling of your product in China. So this can be quite substantial in terms of lost revenues, of course. The license may be revoked, and the NMPA can also confiscate income obtained while the product was sold in its illegal form. There can also be fines of between more than 30% but less than 2 times income obtained. Finally, there's a potential ban of up to 5 years for the relevant representative on producing or selling or importing the relevant device into China. So obviously the implications of getting the UDIs accurate and correct is considerable. Thanks. Back to, I think we're going to move on, Angela, just to talk about next steps, and Victoria is going to take us through some of those.
Yes, thanks Hamish. So what is the sort of scenario as of this month? So if you have a class 3 device and your product is already registered in China, this means that the UDI code must already be on your product and packaging, and that the UDI code must be submitted as part of any registration, renewal, or change application from now on. So if you know that your product needs to be renewed next year, for example, then that UDI code must be submitted as part of that registration renewal. Now, if you have a class 2 device that's already registered in China, you should start preparing for the UDI implementation as if it's going to happen on the 1st of June 2024. So that means that you will need an NMPA approval for the UDI code, and that UDI code must be on the product and packaging that is manufactured on or after the 1st of June 2024. And Hamish will have a look at the process of how to get that UDI code approval in a moment. And then finally, for class 2, is the UDI code must be submitted as part of any registration renewal or change applications going forward. So here, just to finish off, for the existing products already registered in China, if you have a class 1, then there is obviously the option to include a UDI code on your product, and for which you must get an NMPA approval to use that UDI code. And obviously it's a good idea to keep an eye on legislation and with the different phasing coming in the future. But what happens if your product is not yet registered in China? If it is a class 3, then the UDI code must be submitted as part of your registration application. So that's nice and simple. If you have, however, a class 2, there are 2 scenarios here. Firstly, if the registration date on your certificate is on or after the 1st of June 2024, then the UDI code must be submitted as part of a registration application. Now, if it's registered before, so the registration date on the certificate is before the 1st of June 2024, i.e. between now and then you're expecting to get your registration certificate through for a product that's already in the process of being registered, then you need to submit the UDI code to the NMPA for approval, and it must be on the product that is manufactured on or after the 1st of June. And then in terms of class 1, the same situation applies as for the other class 1, is just to keep an eye on the legislation, and you still have the option to include it. So now I'll hand over to Hamish, who will take a look at the process of getting those UDI codes and approvals.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, and just on this slide, we're going to map out a few of the steps as a very high-level overview, of course, of what a typical registration process might look like, incorporating the UDI registration as well. So, as a foreign manufacturer using your NMPA legal agent, this is the scenario we're looking at. This is what we do for our customers. Initially, of course, you select the NMPA legal agent and you prepare the registration documents. In parallel, you write the product technical requirements, which are a key input documentation to the testing process, local testing in China, which is required. You go through and conduct the tests in China. You draft your relevant clinical evaluation report and or clinical trial. You finalize the registration documents and UDI code as well. And so this is where we're really thinking about UDI in parallel. So whilst all of these steps at the top of the slide are happening, you should be identifying or choosing your UDI issuing agency, which Gary has talked about, the 3 options you have. You'd also be generating your UDI code to be able to submit as part of the documentation for the dossier. Then the rest of the registration process for your medical device continues. So you submit your documents to the NMPA, you go through the evaluation process and likely supplementary notice, and then you'll be issued with your registration certificate. All being well, of course. Now that the registration certificate has been received, it's not quite over yet. You then need to do a couple more steps for UDI. You need to submit it expressly to the NMPA for approval, which needs to include the certificate or at least have the information relating to the certificate. Once you've obtained approval from the NMPA for the UDI code, you then apply the UDI to the product and packaging. You also need to upload this UDI to the UDI database in advance of your market launch. Then obviously there's the change management system as well, monitoring potential changes that need to be made. For example, if you change how the product is packaged in sets or otherwise. 2 call-out points it's worthwhile mentioning. Be sure to use only approved UDIs, not ones that you have created without UDI approval, NMPA approval of the UDI, and also obtain the approval and put it on the product, the UDI itself, before placing the product on the market. Otherwise, you risk running into some of the penalties we mentioned earlier. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Hamish. I think we want to step a little bit deeper into the UDI steps. What you provided is an excellent step-by-step framework for registration, incorporating UDI. This slide dives a little bit deeper just into UDI processing. It's somewhat generic, can be used across each of the health authorities. There's 5 basic steps that you want to make sure that you work your way through. A lot of preparation, just becoming familiar with UDI, understanding what the rules are, the nuances for a particular health authority, and preparing your environment. Step 2 there is that actual data preparation and collecting the data. In some cases, you might have data that is in different disparate locations. You might have omissions, so you might have to go and search for some data, do some searching and creating for a particular field, and then make sure that the data that you have is normalized and valid per the requirements of the health authority. So you might actually have some values that don't have the very same format, or they might be equivalent, but you don't have the exact wording from a controlled vocabulary list that is supported by the health authority. And all that is what I mean by normalizing and making sure that it's valid to the particular health authority specifications. Step 3 there is that actual data management system. Where do you store all this? Where do you do your work for the UDI content? Make sure you have a system there and that you have one of those means of reporting that data into the database, and very importantly, making sure that the data has been approved by the health authority, and that you don't have any records that are outstanding or either rejected by the health authority, which certainly can happen, and then you need to apply some remediation to make sure those corrections are in place and then resubmitted. Hamish and Victoria had talked about that labeling update. So many companies have a dedicated labeling system to keep track of the actual design of a label, presenting the barcodes and putting those objects onto the label, and then printing the labels. Many times that is done on demand nowadays, where batch information, serialization, and so on, and certainly the manufacturing date are all controlled by a labeling system and then print appropriately on the label. And then finally, you start up the UDI operation. So all of this is in the context that Hamish just went through of the larger regulatory activities that are conducted for China. Angela, let's switch over to a quick poll, and then we can get into some additional topics here before we close out.
All right, let's go to poll number 2. And this question is, how does your company submit or plan to submit UDI data?
So it looks like my options. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to highlight the options there for manual entry. For outsource, that would obviously be you engage a third party to make submissions manually for you, or you have a system built inside your own firewall that had capabilities submit electronically. And then the 2 options for making use of a vendor tool, installed locally or a cloud-based.
Okay, and we'll give that just a couple more seconds. I see people are deciding how they want to vote there. All right, and thanks so much for playing along here and participating. All right, so we'll close the poll. And then we'll share the results. So I'm assuming you're seeing the shared results there.
Yeah, it looks like 50% have the approach to do manual entry, and followed closely behind by outsourced, and thirdly vendor. All right,
Okay.
very interesting.
Here we go. I can see them now. Thank you. Yeah, just very briefly, we're Cisema, regulatory consultancy and service provider, doing the whole process, helping with regulatory pathway analysis, including feasibility studies to understand what your options are. If clinical trials are needed, understanding what your options and protocol looks like, and implementing and executing those trials, through to registration processes as well. That means dossier preparation, submission, local testing, planning and implementation, in China testing, Hong Kong listing. I'm based in Hong Kong. I have been for over 7 years now, as well as looking at the Greater Bay Area pathways, other alternate pathways for China registration. Local agent as well, we've mentioned that earlier. We act in this role for a number of our customers too. Post-registration as well. Victoria, maybe?
Yes, in terms of post-registration, obviously making sure that you are fully compliant in terms of post-market requirements, so which would obviously include the UDI code, making sure that's all hunky-dory. And then obviously helping you with your advertisement support, and in terms of being a clinical research organization, we can help you with any clinical follow-ups or observational studies that you wish to carry out in China, as well as assisting you with any overseas factory inspections. And we also have a quality compliance role where we can help you adapt your QMS and your SOPs to China compliance requirements, as well as if you get to the point of wishing to actually manufacture in China, we can help you transfer your registration certificate from an overseas manufacturer to an in China manufacturer status. So that's how we can help.
Thank you, Victoria. Real quick overview of the solution that RETEC offers. We do provide that solution there in the center blue of the screen there, and helping manufacturers collect the data, validate the data, store the data, version it in compliant system, and then transfer that data to many different channels, including China NMPA database. So there is a lot of flexibility on receiving data, anywhere from simple file uploads to API connections into our system. And then we take care of that actual submission over to different health authorities. Next screen, for time's sake, we'll just quickly mention this, where there is a model where corporate users around the world can use our system and then include local users. So for example, Cisema has like 5 offices, I think, inside China, and they can act as your local user, or you might have another local user. All of those can be members and work inside the RETEC system as a collaborative team. The information is then shared and visible to all, and then that system then can submit into the NMPA database. So with that, I think that concludes the prepared presentation. Angela, how do people get in contact with these 2 companies?
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. You'll see our contact information on the screen. RETEC is always available by email at MedDevice@retec.com, and Cisema there at officehk@cisema.com. Do contact us with any questions that you have. Today's presentation, again, has been recorded, and the links to the slides and the recording will be sent to all registrants as soon as we package up the event. We do have quite a few questions that came in. I think we're only going to have time to take a couple of these, but we will get back to folks individually. And thank you so much for submitting these. These are really valuable. Give us a little bit of insight into what you're thinking about, what you're dealing with. So I'm going to start with the first question. Are the UDI numbers, such as the UDI-DI, provided by the GS1 China, also valid in the US and other countries as well? Gary, maybe we can have you take that one.
Yeah, that's a real quick answer. Yes. So any GS1 organization that a member, any manufacturer that subscribed to a GS1 organization, whether it be GS1 China, GS1 Australia, GS1 in Europe, Switzerland, US, wherever, that number is universal. So it is able to be used around the world.
All right, terrific. Next question. For a class 1 medical device over-the-counter product, can we just sell in China with a CE registration?
There's a simple answer to that as well. No, you need to make a specific China submission. Your CE mark will be a basis for that filing. It's a filing. It's not a registration for a class 1 product. But just because it's class 1 in Europe doesn't necessarily mean it's class 1 in China. It's likely, but it's not certain. And there's a specific dossier preparation and submission process for that filing as well.
Okay, great. Another follow-up from this person. Does UDI requirements such as label requirements change according to the class 1, 2, or 3? Gary, you want to take that one?
I'm not aware of any changes. There might be some additional requirements that Hamish or Victoria are aware of, but certainly the identification is universal. And there's nothing in the G10 number that would identify a particular class. Victoria, Hamish, anything to add to that?
No, the labeling requirements apply to all classes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And we'll take one last question here. For the smallest selling unit, is it smallest selling unit to the end user or to the retailer, such as a pharmacy?
I've heard a lot of discussion on that. My interpretation, and again, Hamish and Victoria jump in here. I believe it's to the smallest selling unit to the end user. So think about the intent. NMPA would like to have end users be able to identify products and report adverse events if necessary. So if you sell a box of 100 units, but over the course of that life's logistic supply chain, that box is broken apart, and Victoria might only buy one of those 100 items. So if there's an issue that Victoria has or needs to identify, gain additional information, and contact the company, whatever, the identification down has to be down at the end user level. So, hey, Victoria, Hamish?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I
thank
think
you.
so.
Okay, well, I think we're at the hour. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to our guest panelists from Cisema. Valuable information, and we appreciate the participation by all the registrants. We'll be in touch with you over email. Thank you again. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time at the next event.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks
bye now.
everybody.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.